Variant. False identity. Marin had spent 3 years learning to smell like someone else. Not literally. Though the herbalists in the lower quarter sold tinctures for that too. Cedar and clove ground into a paste that could suppress the faint mineral trace of omega blood for nearly 6 hours. She used them on ceremony days, on market days, on any day when the pack hierarchy required her to stand in a line and be assessed. But the deeper camouflage was subtler than scent. It lived in how she held her shoulders, not too low, which would signal submission, not too square, which would invite challenge. It lived in the borrowed clothes she wore, on formal occasions, the gray linen that neither announced poverty nor reached for status. It lived in the careful blankness she kept over her face whenever a dominant wolf passed within scenting range and their nostrils flared, testing the air. She had become, through patient effort, someone the pack hierarchy simply could not place. That had been enough. For 3 years it had been enough. Because the old alpha had been careless about such things. Content to let the rank oddities sort themselves out through work assignments and informal pack dynamics, rather than formal declaration. Marin had been assigned to the record hall, which suited her perfectly. She had a gift for the old scripts, for the layered archival language that older pack law was written in, and the record hall smelled primarily of paper and ink, not of dominant wolves measuring one another. Then the old alpha died, and the ceremony changed everything. The naming ceremony was mandatory. That word, mandatory, had been posted on every board in the settlement 3 weeks ago, and Marin had read it standing in the gray dawn outside the record hall, with a feeling in her stomach like swallowing a stone. Every wolf, every rank, every bloodline registered in the new Alpha King's central ledger. His name was Callum Voss. She had heard it spoken with the particular reverence reserved for men who had earned their title through something other than inheritance, which generally meant either extraordinary violence or extraordinary cunning, sometimes both. She had spent the full 3 weeks preparing. The tincture was fresh, applied an hour before the ceremony. Her gray linen was pressed. Her paperwork, the documents that identified her as Marin Solis, keeper of records, mid-rank, unaffiliated bloodline, had been drawn up with her own careful hand, which meant every word was technically true, and every implication was carefully curated. She was a keeper of records. She was unaffiliated. The mid-rank designation was the lie she could not quite bring herself to write plainly. So instead she had written it as an absence. Bloodline classification pending full assessment. In the record hall's formal language, pending full assessment was simply accurate. She stood in line now with the rest of her hall cohort, 43 wolves in gray and brown. The administrative workers who kept the settlement's law and memory intact. The ceremony yard was cold in the early morning, frost still on the stone flags, and Marin watched the Alpha King receive each wolf in turn from her position near the end of the line. She had not expected him to be so still. The powerful men she had known, the dominant wolves who moved through pack space like weather, scenting everything, marking territory with their presence, were never still. They circulated, they radiated. Alpha energy was, in her experience, a kind of constant low broadcast, impossible to ignore, like standing near a fire. Callum Voss stood at the end of the receiving platform and received each wolf without movement, without that restless marking energy she had come to associate with dominance, and somehow that was worse. The stillness meant he was not broadcasting outward. He was taking in. He was listening. Marin felt the stone in her stomach shift and settle lower. She had 20 minutes before her turn. She used them to breathe slowly, to press her feet flat against the cold stone through her boots, to remind herself that the tincture held, that her documents were in order, that pending full assessment was simply accurate. She was very good at this. She had been doing it for 3 years. The line moved forward in increments, each wolf stepping up to the platform, bowing the slight formal bow that registered submission to the new reign, offering their paperwork, receiving their mark in the new ledger. When there were 5 wolves between her and the platform, Marin noticed that Callum Voss had stopped reading the documents. He was still accepting them, still passing them to the registrar, who stood at his right hand with the open ledger. But his eyes had lifted from the papers. They were moving along the remaining line with something that looked, from 20 feet away, like patience. She told herself he was simply tired. The ceremony had been running since dawn. It was natural to let the registrar handle the documentation and simply receive. When there were two wolves between her and the platform, she noticed that his eyes had stopped moving. They had stopped on her. She did not look directly at him. That was important. Direct eye contact with a dominant wolf you did not know was an invitation or a challenge, depending on context, and she had no interest in either. She kept her gaze at middle distance, at the back of the wolf in front of her, and told herself that her peripheral vision was unreliable in the early morning light. Then the wolf in front of her stepped forward, and she was next. And she could no longer pretend. She did not feel the weight of his attention, like a hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades. She stepped up onto the platform. She offered her documents with both hands, the formal gesture of a mid-rank wolf to an alpha. She executed the slight bow. She fixed her gaze at the level of his chest and waited. He took the documents. He did not pass them to the registrar. The silence stretched for 4 seconds. 5. Long enough that the registrar shifted his weight, and the wolf waiting behind Marin in line made a small restless sound. Then Callum Voss said, in a voice pitched low enough that only she and the registrar could hear it clearly, "Bloodline classification pending full assessment." "Yes, Alpha King. How long has it been pending?" She had prepared for this. "Since my assignment to the record hall, Alpha King." The previous Alpha's office did not complete the formal process before his passing. All of that was true. She had been very careful about what she put on paper and what she said aloud. Callum Voss looked up from the documents and met her eyes. She felt the recognition move through her like something struck, not painfully but cleanly, the way cold water moves through the body on a summer day. His eyes were not gold, which surprised her. She had expected gold. The dominant wolves she had known in her childhood all had that amber gold shift in their irises when they were assessing. His were a steady dark gray, and they did not shift color at all. They simply held. "Your name is Marin Solis," he said. "Yes, Alpha King." He studied her for another moment, that gray gaze moving over her face, with the careful attention of someone reading a text in a language they almost knew. Then he handed her documents to the registrar and said, "Entered as presented. Welcome to the new ledger." She bowed. She stepped down off the platform. She walked back to her place in the cohort, with her shoulders at the correct angle, and her face carefully blank, and she did not allow herself to feel the relief until she was 40 feet away, and certain he could not see her exhale. She told herself that was the end of it. She was wrong. She did not smell the cedar until later that evening, when she was alone in the record hall, running the last of the day's new registrations through the archive system. Cross-referencing bloodlines against the old ledgers, the way she had been doing since she was 17 years old. The record hall was empty at that hour. The archive lamps were lit in their brass housings along the south wall. The frost had come back with the dark, and she could feel it in the stone floor even through her boots. She smelled cedar and something beneath it. Warm stone, old wood, the particular mineral depth that she had learned to associate with high-dominant wolves in calm state. Not broadcasting, not marking, simply present. She turned from the ledger shelf, and Callum Voss was standing in the doorway of the record hall. He was not in ceremony clothes. He wore a plain dark coat and boots, and he had come without the registrar, without the guards who had flanked him all day on the platform. He looked like a man who had come to return a book. "The hall is closed, Alpha King," she said, because she could not think of anything else to say, and silence felt more dangerous. "I know," he said. "I have a key." Of course he did. He had keys to everything now. He crossed the hall without invitation, and stood on the other side of the work table, looking at the ledger she had open in front of her. She did not close it. Closing it would have looked like she was hiding something. "You cross-reference the new registrations against the old bloodline records," he said. It was not a question. "It's standard archival practice," she said. "The new ledger needs to connect to the historical record. Otherwise, the lineage documentation is incomplete." "Show me." She showed him. She had no reason not to. The work was legitimate, the methodology was sound, and part of her professional pride was stronger than her wariness. She walked him through the cross-reference system. The way the old scripts encoded bloodline markers, the symbolic language that predated the written pack law by several generations. She heard herself explaining it with more detail than she had intended, because he asked precise questions, and his gray eyes moved across the old pages, with the focused attention of someone who had been reading archival texts for years. "Where did you learn this?" he said when she had finished. "Here," she said. "The record hall has a complete library. The previous Alpha's archivist taught me the old scripts when I was first assigned. And before you were assigned here? She met his eyes. I came from the border territories, Alpha King, the Northern Holdings. She watched him place it, the way his expression shifted with the precision of a man indexing a name. The Northern Holdings. The bloodlines that had been absorbed into the main pack 3 generations ago, whose rank designations had been reclassified in the transition. Some elevated, some, deliberately, strategically, obscured. His eyes stayed on her face. How long? He said quietly. Have you been running your own classification? The stone in her stomach was gone. In its place was something colder and more specific. I don't know what you mean, Alpha King. He did not press it. He looked at the ledger for another moment, then stepped back from the table. The record hall will be essential to the new administration, he said. I want a full audit of the historical bloodline documentation. I'll need someone who knows the old scripts. I can recommend several archivists. I'll need the best one, he said. He left without saying her name again, but she felt his certainty moving through the hall after him, like cedar smoke, slow and deliberate, settling into the old paper and the cold stone. He knew something. She was not sure yet how much. The next morning, a formal appointment notice arrived at the record hall, addressed to Marin Solis, keeper of records. She was to report to the Alpha King's working offices at the 9th hour, to begin consultation on the historical bloodline audit. She read it 3 times. Then she pressed her palms flat against the work table and breathed until her pulse steadied. The tincture wore off in 6 hours. She would need to bring a great deal more. The audit began simply enough. The Alpha King's working office was a large, plain room on the eastern side of the main hall. Not the ceremonial chamber, which was all carved stone and formal heraldry, but a working space, bookshelves and 2 wide tables and a fireplace that was clearly used daily. He was already there when she arrived. A stack of old ledgers open in front of him, and he gestured to the second table without ceremony and said, The bloodline records from the absorption period, 3 generations back. I want to understand what was classified and why. She sat. She opened the first ledger. She began to explain. It was careful work and she was good at it, and she told herself that as long as she stayed in the professional register, archivist explaining documentation to administrator, she was on safe ground. He was a thorough reader. He flagged anomalies without prompting, cross-referenced dates without being shown how, asked questions that suggested he had been working through other sources independently. She began, against her better judgment, to respect the quality of his attention. On the 3rd day, he said, There's a bloodline category here that doesn't appear in the new registration documents. She did not look up from her ledger. Which category, Alpha King? He read the old script notation aloud, and she felt the cold come up through her feet from the stone floor, or perhaps from somewhere inside herself. And she kept her eyes on the page in front of her and said, That category was reclassified in the absorption. Reclassified to what? The documentation is incomplete, she said. And she heard how careful her voice was, and she suspected he heard it too. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, We'll come back to it, and turned to the next page, and she breathed again. He watched her. She felt it. He was not overt about it. She was coming to understand. A man who had learned to conduct surveillance with the same patience he brought to everything else. The same gray stillness that had unsettled her on the ceremony platform. He never asked her directly. He simply created conditions in which the truth had more and more room to emerge, and then he waited. She had been doing this for 3 years. She knew how to wait longer, but she had not factored in the wolf. The wolf was the thing she had not prepared for. The instinct, the mate bond recognition, that existed below the layer of tinctures and careful posture and professionally curated documents. That recognition did not care about strategy. It moved in the spaces between words in the moment when their hands were both on the same old ledger, and she felt the warmth of him through the paper. In the late afternoons, when the fire had burned down, and the lamps were lit, and the record hall smelled of cedar and old ink, and something that was not quite either, she was falling asleep over a ledger on the 8th day when she felt his presence change. Not his attention. His attention had been on her consistently, patient and precise. This was different. This was the particular held-still quality of a dominant wolf who has caught a scent that means something to him and is working very hard not to react. She had let the tincture lapse. She had worked for 11 hours. She had not thought about it. She had been explaining a particularly complex piece of bloodline notation, and she had been genuinely interested. And she had not thought about the tincture since the 9th hour. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was not the cataloging attention of the past 8 days. It was something older and more immediate, and his gray eyes had not changed color, but something in them had shifted. The way the quality of light changes when a cloud moves. He said very quietly, "Marin." Just her name. Nothing else. She closed the ledger in front of her with careful hands. She set her palms flat on the cover and looked at him directly. Something she had been avoiding for 8 days, and she said, "I should go, it's late." "Yes," he said. He did not move to stop her. She rose from the table. She gathered her notes. She walked to the door of the office and put her hand on the frame, and then she stopped, because she could feel him behind her, the way you feel heat from a fire even when you have turned your back to it, and she said without turning around, "I'll return the documents tomorrow, Alpha King." "I know you will," he said. She left. She did not sleep. The formal summons arrived the following morning, before the 9th hour. Not an appointment notice. A summons, bearing the Alpha King's seal, requiring her presence before the full administrative council for a bloodline verification hearing. Someone had filed the complaint. She had known, on some level, that someone would eventually. There were wolves in the new administration who had been pressing for a full reclassification audit since the ceremony, who wanted every pending designation resolved, who had their own reasons for wanting the northern bloodlines mapped clearly. She had not known it would happen on the 9th day. She dressed carefully. She did not use the tincture. If it was going to end, she had decided somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn. It would end with her standing in her own scent, in her own body, in her own blood. She was tired of the mineral paste, and the careful shoulders, and the borrowed gray linen. She was tired of pending full assessment as a permanent condition of her existence. She wore the blue dress that had been her grandmother's, the one she kept in the cedar chest and never put on for ceremony days, because it had embroidery at the collar and cuffs that was not quite the embroidery of a mid-rank wolf's formal wear. It was older than that. It was Northern Holdings' formal dress, the kind that had been worn before the absorption reclassified everything. And it had a particular pattern at the collar that anyone who knew the old bloodline notation would recognize immediately. She had never worn it in public before. She wore it now. The administrative council chamber was formal stone, high-ceilinged, with benches along both walls for observers and a raised dais at the far end where the council sat. There were 7 council members, 4 of them wolves she recognized from the registration ceremony, and at the center of the dais, Callum Voss. The chamber was half full. Wolves she worked with, some curious, some carefully neutral. Near the back she noticed 2 of the Northern Holdings wolves who had registered early in the ceremony. Women, about her age, who had submitted their bloodline documentation without the careful evasions she had spent 3 years constructing. They were watching her with expressions she could not read from across the chamber. A council member, she did not know by name, read the complaint into the record. Bloodline misrepresentation, falsification of rank documentation, deliberate suppression of lineage classification. She stood and listened and kept her hands still at her sides. When the reading was finished, the same council member said, "The subject is invited to respond." She had prepared words for this moment. Careful, technical words about archival classification practices and the incompleteness of the absorption-era records and the legitimate professional judgment involved in designating her own status as pending. All of it was defensible. All of it was technically true. She looked at Callum Voss. He was watching her with that gray, steady gaze that she had spent 9 days trying to navigate, and something in his expression, not sympathy, not warning, something more specific than either, something that looked like it was waiting for her to make a choice, made the carefully prepared words dissolve. She reached up and touched the embroidery at her collar. "My name is Marin Solis," she said, and her voice was steady. "My grandmother was Lyra Solis of the Northern Holdings, born under the pre-absorption bloodline designations. By the classification system that was in use before the absorption, her bloodline would have ranked as primary heritage, senior line, second branch." She felt the shift in the room, not sound, not movement, but a change in the quality of attention, the way air changes before rain. The absorption reclassified that designation as mid-rank unaffiliated. The documentation that governed the reclassification was processed through this settlement's own record hall. I have read it many times. I know what it says and what it does not say. The council member who had read the complaint said, "And your own classification?" She kept her eyes on Callum Voss. "Primary heritage carries through the matrilineal line," she said. "My mother's designation was suppressed in her own registration documents. I was registered at birth under her suppressed designation, which is how I came to carry a mid-rank classification." She paused. "The classification I have been living under is the one I was given. The documents I submitted at the naming ceremony reflected that classification accurately. What I did not volunteer is that the classification itself is based on documentation that was improperly processed at the time of the absorption." The chamber was very quiet. "You are asserting primary heritage," said the council member. "I am stating what the historical record shows," she said. "I have been reading that record for 3 years. I know it better than anyone in this settlement." She let that sit for a moment. "I also know that the record has been curated, in several places, to obscure exactly this kind of lineage. Someone knew what was being suppressed. I don't know who made those decisions or why, but I know what the unaltered record says, and I know what my grandmother's embroidery means, and I know what I am." The silence stretched. Then Callum Voss spoke for the first time since the hearing had begun. "Show me," he said. She turned to the side table where she had been told to place her documents. She had not brought the curated registration papers. She had brought, instead, the archival copies she had made over 3 years of record hall work, the original absorption documents, the reclassification processing records, the pre-absorption bloodline notation that showed, clearly and without ambiguity, the Solis family lineage. She had been building this for 3 years. Not to present it, simply to know it existed, somewhere in the world, accurate and complete. She placed the file on the council table and stepped back. Callum Voss came down from the dais. He crossed to the table without looking at the council members, which told her something about the kind of alpha king he was. He opened the file, he read. She watched him, read the way she had watched him, read the old ledgers, tracking where his eyes paused, where his expression shifted, where he cross-referenced in his own mind what he was seeing against what he already knew. He was thorough, he always was. He read for a long time, the chamber waited. When he finished, he closed the file with the same careful hands she recognized from the working sessions. And he looked up at her, and she braced for the judgment, for the formal language of pack law that would determine what happened next. "Censure, dismissal, reclassification, exile," he said. "The documentation is genuine. To the council. Not a question, a declaration. The bloodline suppression in the absorption records is documented here," he said. "Marin Solis has submitted accurate historical evidence of improper classification." He looked around the chamber with the gray calm that she had spent 9 days failing to anticipate. "The hearing is concluded. The classification stands corrected. Her designation will be re-entered in the central ledger as primary heritage, senior line, second branch, Northern Holdings." The council member who had read the complaint said, "Alpha King, the question of falsification." She submitted documents that reflected the classification she was given. Callum Voss said, "She did not create that classification. She has now provided evidence that it was itself falsified by this administration's predecessors. If there is a falsification question before this council, I suggest they direct their attention to the absorption-era records and the individuals who process them." He paused. "That investigation will begin immediately. I will require the record hall's full cooperation." He looked at Marin. "As the settlement's most qualified archival expert on this period," he said, "I would like you to lead it." She had prepared for judgment. She had prepared for exiles or censure, or the particular cold efficiency of pack law, applied to someone who had been navigating its edges for years. She had not prepared for this, for the clean, public, irrevocable validation of what she had spent 3 years hiding, because she did not believe anyone in authority would ever choose to see it. Her throat was tight. She did not allow herself to look away from him. "Yes, Alpha King," she said. She heard the 2 Northern Holdings women at the back of the chamber move. A small sound, breath released, weight shifted. And she did not look at them either, because if she did, she was going to lose the careful composure she had been holding for the last 20 minutes, and she was not going to do that here. She saved it for the corridor outside, when the chamber had begun to empty, and she was standing alone against the cold stone wall. and the hearing's proceedings were still ringing in the formal silence. And she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for exactly 1 moment and breathed. He found her there. She had not heard him come out. "You brought the file," he said. "I've had it for 3 years, but you didn't present it before." She looked at him. He was standing a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the cedar and warm stone clearly, without the tincture filtering anything. Just him. Just the mate scent that had been moving under every interaction since the first morning in the record hall, patient and certain, waiting for her to stop suppressing it. "I didn't know if anyone would believe it," she said. "Or if believing it would matter." He was quiet for a moment. "What made you decide to bring it today?" She thought about the careful prepared words she had abandoned. She thought about the blue dress in the cedar chest. She thought about 3 years of pressed gray linen and borrowed status, and the patient work of becoming someone the hierarchy could not quite place. "I was tired," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment and then he said, "I recognized your bloodline at the ceremony. The scent marker, it's distinct. At that heritage level. I've encountered it twice before. In families from the northern holdings who had undergone the same suppression." She stared at him. "You knew, at the ceremony." "I knew something wasn't adding up," he said. "I didn't know what you knew, or what you had. I needed to see what you would do with it." The cold in the corridor was specific and clarifying, like the first breath after a long time indoors. "That was surveillance," she said. "Yes," he said without apology. "And if I had never brought the file," he held her gaze steadily, "I would have brought it on your behalf. I had already begun my own research." He paused. "But I wanted to see if you trusted the record you had built. I wanted to see if you trusted yourself." She thought about that. She thought about the 9 days of careful professional distance, the tinctures wearing off, the blue dress in the cedar chest, the moment in the hearing chamber when the prepared words had dissolved, and she had touched the embroidery at her collar instead. She thought about his gray eyes on the ceremony platform, holding her, patient and certain, in a way that her wolf had felt, and her strategy had spent 9 days trying to explain away. "You couldn't have known I would present the file today," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I knew by the 8th day that you had one. You handle the absorption-era records the way someone handles documents they've read 1,000 times. You knew every anomaly before I flagged it. You weren't learning the material. You were showing it to me." She had not known that about herself. She turned that over carefully. "And last night," she said, "when the tincture lapsed." His expression shifted, not dramatically but precisely the way it always shifted, as if each small change were a considered choice. "The scent marker, yes. Clear as anything I've smelled in years. Did that change anything about the hearing?" "No," he said. "The hearing was always going to go the way it went. The file is unambiguous." He was quiet for a moment. "But it changed something for me." She waited. He said, "I've been aware of the mate bond since the ceremony. I expect you have been too, beneath whatever you were using to suppress it." She did not deny it. The corridor was cold, and the chamber behind them was emptying, and she was standing in her grandmother's blue dress with the embroidery at her collar, and 3 years of careful concealment behind her, and she was done with strategic ambiguity. "Yes," she said. He exhaled slowly, the first truly unguarded thing she had seen him do. "Then I would like to ask you something," he said, "that is not related to the audit or the reclassification or anything that comes next administratively." She looked at him. "Ask." He met her eyes with the gray, steady gaze that had held her since the ceremony platform, and he said, "Would you be willing to let me court you? Formally, without surveillance or strategy on either side." The corridor was cold. Her grandmother's embroidery was at her collar. The mate bond was humming in her chest, like cedar smoke and old paper, and the particular mineral warmth of his scent, unfiltered. And she felt the 3-year weight of careful camouflage dissolve from her shoulders all at once, not painfully but cleanly, the way ice leaves stone in the first real days of spring. She thought about what it would mean. The reclassification would make her visible in ways she had spent years avoiding. The audit would require her to be the public face of a process that would unsettle half the old administration's allies. And courtship with the Alpha King, formal and acknowledged, would make her more visible still. Would make the soulless bloodline and everything it meant into something that could not be misplaced or suppressed again. She thought about the file she had carried for 3 years in the archive drawer, behind the secondary ledger shelf, the one she had built piece by piece in the quiet evenings, not to present, simply to know it existed. She thought about building things for other people to find. Yes, she said. His expression did not transform. He was not, she was learning, a man of dramatic transformations. But something in the stillness changed quality, the way the light changes when a cloud moves, and he looked at her with something that was entirely unguarded and entirely steady, and she felt her wolf settle in a way it had not settled in years. The audit began the following week. It was methodical, painstaking, politically complex, exactly what she had known it would be. 3 members of the old administration's record staff resigned within the first 10 days, which told her something. 7 absorption-era bloodline cases were opened for formal review. The Northern Holdings women who had been at the chamber came to the record hall on the second day, and Marin sat with them for 2 hours and went through the documentation carefully. And when they left, they had copies of their own corrected lineage records in their hands. She wore the blue dress on the days she presented to the council. The formal courtship was conducted in the way Callum Voss conducted everything, with thorough patience and without performance. He came to the record hall in the evenings, not always, but often enough that the archive staff knew to leave the lamp lit. They worked through the audit documentation together, and they talked. Not always about the work, not always about pack politics, sometimes about the old scripts and what they revealed, about the people who had written them, about what it meant to preserve a record, and what it meant to suppress one. She showed him the pre-absorption bloodline notation, in the way she had always wanted to show it to someone. Completely, without the careful evasions, without the practiced blankness over her face. She showed him the soulless family entry, her grandmother's name in the old script, the notation that meant senior line, second branch. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then he looked at her. She knew what she smelled like to him. She had stopped using the tincture entirely the day after the hearing. There was no point to it anymore, and more than that, she found she did not want the distance it created. She wanted to be exactly as legible as she was, wanted the mate bond to register clearly between them, wanted him to know without ambiguity what she was and what she had chosen. He brought her, in the 5th week of the audit, to the border territories. Not formally, not with ceremony, just the 2 of them, and 2 of his quiet, competent guard wolves, riding north on a gray morning when the frost was still on the ground. He wanted to see the Northern Holdings, he said. He wanted to see what the absorption had done to the landscape as well as the records. She had not been back since she was 17 years old. The Holdings were cold and spare, the way she remembered, the long hills running north, and the particular gray-silver quality of the light that was different from the settlement light, older somehow, as if the sky itself were a different material here. The pack structures had been absorbed and reconfigured, but the bones of the old layout were still visible, if you knew what you were looking for, which she did. She showed him where the soulless family hall had stood. Just the foundation stones now, grass-covered, a pale line in the earth that you would miss if you were not looking for it. He stood beside her in the gray morning light and looked at the foundation stones for a long time. Then he said, "I want to build a formal record of the Northern Holdings bloodlines, not as an administrative exercise, as a historical record, a true one, not another managed document." She turned to look at him. "I want to publish it," he said, "formally under the Alpha King's authority, so it cannot be suppressed again." She thought about her grandmother's name in the old script. She thought about the file in the archive drawer, the one she had built piece by piece, knowing it might never be seen. She thought about building things for other people to find. "I can write it," she said. "I know the material better than anyone." "I know," he said. He turned to look at her in the gray northern light, and she felt the mate bond hum between them, warm and steady and completely unguarded, and his gray eyes were as steady as they had always been. "I've known since the ceremony." She had spent 3 years becoming someone the hierarchy could not place. She had learned to hold her shoulders at the correct angle, to suppress her scent, to keep her face carefully blank, to present herself as an absence, pending full assessment, bloodline classification incomplete, waiting to be told what she was. She did not need to be told anymore. The published record went out under her name, Marin Solis, Keeper of Records, Primary Heritage, Senior Line, Second Branch, Northern Holdings. It was the most thorough bloodline documentation the pack had produced in 3 generations. It corrected 47 suppressed lineage classifications. It named, in plain language, what the absorption had done, and what the records had been made to hide. It also, buried in the methodological acknowledgments in the kind of dry archival language that she had spent her career learning to read, contained a sentence that any wolf who knew the old scripts would recognize. The work of accurate record is not the work of power, but the work of patience, and the patience belongs to whoever is willing to stay and read until the truth becomes legible. She did not tell Callum Voss she had written it there. He found it on the third day after publication. He came to the record hall in the evening, with the lamp already lit, and he opened the published document to the acknowledgments page and read the sentence aloud in the old script notation, which sounded different when spoken, heavier, more formal, carrying the weight of the generations it had been used to encode. She watched him read it from across the work table. He looked up. "You've been writing that sentence for a long time," he said. "Since I was 22, she said. "I just never knew where to put it." He closed the document. He set it carefully on the table between them. He looked at her with the gray, steady, entirely unguarded attention that she had spent 3 years failing to suppress her response to, and she felt the mate bond settle into her bones the way spring settles into cold ground. Gradually and then all at once, certain and irreversible, the kind of warmth that you stop noticing because it has simply become the temperature of everything. "Marin," he said. "Yes," she said, before he could finish, because she knew what he was going to ask and she had known her answer for weeks. Had perhaps known it since the ceremony platform when his gray eyes had held hers, and she had felt the recognition move through her like cold water on a summer day. She was done with pending. She was done with classification incomplete. She crossed to him, and he met her in the middle of the work table's length. And when he put his hand against her face, she turned into it the way a plant turns toward light. Not a decision, exactly. Just the body knowing what it had always known and finally being allowed to act on it. And she smelled cedar and warm stone and old paper, and underneath all of it the deep, specific mineral warmth that was his wolf and her wolf, and the bond between them that had been waiting since the ceremony. With the same patient certainty he brought to everything. The lamp burned down, and the frost came back with the dark outside the rec hall windows, and neither of them noticed. Spring came early that year to the Northern Holdings. The historical record was formally published, translated into the modern pack notation, and distributed to every administrative hall in the territory. The 47 corrected lineage classifications were entered into the central ledger, and the wolves who carried them, including the 2 women who had sat at the back of the hearing chamber and watched with unreadable expressions, received their formal documentation with the Alpha King's seal and their correct bloodline designations written in plain, unambiguous language that could not be reclassified or suppressed. The Solis family hall was not rebuilt. Marin did not want it rebuilt. The foundation stones were enough, a record in the earth, visible if you knew what you were looking for, which she did. What she wanted, and what she had, was the record hall, and the lamp in its brass housing, and the working table, where the new ledgers lay open alongside the old ones, and the man who came in the evenings and read the old scripts beside her with careful attention and gray eyes that had never once looked away. Her wolf had known him at the ceremony, on the cold stone flags in the early morning frost, before she had a name for him, or a strategy to manage him, or a tincture to suppress what recognition felt like. Her wolf had known, with the wordless precision of something older than language, that the stillness in him was not indifference but patience, that the gray eyes were not cold but clear, that the man who had held her gaze and said her name and accepted her documents without judgment was the one who would, eventually, read everything she had written. All of it, the file in the archive drawer, the sentence in the acknowledgments, the 3 years of careful camouflage, hiding a bloodline that had always, underneath everything, known exactly what it was. She was no longer pending. She was finally and completely found.